And we're really pleased to welcome Ole Bjerg.
Thank you. First, I want to start by saying that if we want a sustainable economy, we have to reform the money system. That was true 2 years ago, it was true 1 year ago, and it's still true today. So I will now give my third speech on that very same topic. I'll be talking about this concept of helicopter money, and especially towards the end, it may get a little bit technical, and I hope to compensate for that by starting with a joke. It's not a joke I've made, don't worry. It's a joke that I came across in a book of one of my favorite philosophers, Slavoj Žižek, and it's a Croatian joke, and it's about the former Croatian president Franjo Tuđman, and the background. So what's happening in the joke is that Franjo Tuđman, he has this large family, and they're flying in a plane over Croatia. Aware of the rumors that a lot of Croats lead miserable, unhappy lives while he and his cronies amass wealth, Tuđman says, "What if I were to throw a check for $1 million out of the window to make at least one Croat who will catch it happy?" His flattering wife says, "But Franco, my dear, why don't you throw out 2 checks for $500,000 each and thus make 2 Croats happy?" His daughter asked, "Why not 4 checks for $250,000 each and make 4 Croats happy?" And so on, until finally his grandson, the proverbial innocent youth, who unknowingly blurts out the truth, says, "But grandpa, why don't you simply throw yourself out of the window and thus make all the Croats happy?" So the reason why I quote this joke is because, in a way, it's about helicopter money. It's about throwing money out of a helicopter to the people. The concept of helicopter money was originally phrased by Milton Friedman, the economist Milton Friedman, and it refers to the idea that central banks can create money out of nothing and then send them directly into the economy, as if kind of throwing them out of a helicopter. If you are a money nerd as myself, then when you hear this joke, the first thing you ask yourself, or at least that's what I did, was, okay, so what account is this money? So he throws out these checks. So of course you ask, so to what account do these checks correspond? And I can kind of see 3 options. The first one is that they come out of Tuđman's own private account. In that case, it's just philanthropy. It can also go out of the Treasury's account, the Croatian Treasury's account. In that case, it's fiscal policy. But it can also be drawn on the Croatian central bank itself. And in that case, we're talking about monetary policy, and we're talking about true helicopter money, because then the money is created and then sent into the economy. I think some of you have probably heard this quote before. It's also from Friedman. And what Friedman says is, "Only a crisis produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function." When he says our, he means economists. "That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until," and here the key formulation comes, "until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." And I think the reason why I've picked this concept of helicopter money as sort of the center of my speech today is because I think we are at a point in time where helicopter money is in fact something that used to be politically impossible, but now may seem to become politically inevitable. And the reason for that is that we're in a situation where interest rates are approaching 0, quantitative easing, which is done today by central banks, European Central Bank, the English, the American, the Japanese, is not working. It's not doing what they want it to do. Which means that central banks are kind of running out of monetary tools. And that means that now we're in a situation where helicopter money is being seriously considered among policymakers as well as central bankers. But at the same time, that makes it even more crucial that now, if helicopter money is becoming politically inevitable, we want to make sure that when they start dropping money out of helicopters, we want them to drop them in the right places. So at the heart of the issue of sustainability in Denmark, we find the crisis in the agricultural sector. I just recently read a small little book by Jørgen Steen Nielsen. It's in Danish. I think it's called What Shall We Do with the Agriculture, or What Shall We Do with the Farmers? I can really recommend it. It's a good book. And what Jørgen shows is how Danish farmers they are squeezed between, in Denmark we have this expression, lus mellem to negle, which means a louse between two nails. But I think the English phrase is actually more appropriate here, because I looked it up, and what they say in English is a pig in the middle. So the Danish farmers are pigs in the middle. Yeah. Okay, so what in the middle of what? Well, they're sort of in the middle of, on the one hand, they're suffering from falling prices on pork and milk due to more and more international or even global competition, on the one hand. And on the other hand, they have rising levels of debt. And for them, the only sort of way out of this position is further expansion. So more technology, more intense and specialized forms of production, less sustainable production, and also more debt, because they have to finance these expansions. So Jørgen Steen Nielsen proposes a very good idea, which is a land reform. So he says we should make a public land trust that could buy out insolvent farmers. So they would take on their debts, and they would then also take their land, or buy their land, so to speak, and then lease it back to the farmer. So the farmer could go on farming without having all this debt. And in that reform, we could then put a requirement to the farmer to say, you can keep on farming, however, we want you to do it in a sustainable fashion. I think that's a brilliant idea. I think it has only one minor flaw, which is the fact that in order to fund or finance this land trust, the government would have to go out and borrow a lot of money. And I don't think there's any reason for this. So what I want to propose here is to re-raise Jørgen Steen Nielsen, to use a poker expression, and to combine this idea of a land reform with a monetary reform. And the monetary reform I am talking about here it's also called the sovereign money reform. And the idea is basically to move money creation from private commercial banks and into the central bank. One of the big challenges in this reform is the transition. So the transition from the system we have today, where private banks create money, to a system where our money is in the central bank. So today, we have a money supply in Denmark of around 1,100 billion kroner. That's something like this. Yeah, that's all the money that if we take all the money that all of us have sitting in private banks, in our accounts in private banks, it adds up to that money. So the challenge here is how do we move that over into the central bank? So if the Nationalbank was to simply create, they could do that. They could create all of this money out of nothing, and then give each of us an account in the central bank with, let's say I have now 5,000 in my account with my bank. Then I would, the next day I would have an account with an equivalent amount in the national bank. If they were to do that, and then just wipe out this money, that would be a huge subsidy to the banks, because this actually represents money that the private banks owe to us. So the challenge here is that the private banks, in order to move this money from the private banks to the central bank, the private banks have to pay something in exchange for this. And the problem is, of course, they don't have any money. They only have the money that they've created themselves. So how could we solve this problem? And part of a solution to that problem would be this land reform. So Jørgen Steen Nielsen provides some interesting numbers in his book. One of them is the total amount of debt in the agricultural sector, and that amounts to 371 billion kroner. Still a lot of money, but as you can see, it's not as much as the other figure. So what we could do was to say, and these are, I think it's fair to sort of assume that most of them are in mortgage bonds, realkreditobligationer. So basically what the central bank could do was to buy all of these mortgage bonds and then put them onto their balance sheet, and then in return for this purchase, they would then wipe out part of this figure. Yeah? And in fact, this procedure where the central bank, or Nationalbank, where they purchase all these mortgage bonds from the central bank, from the commercial banks, it's not very different from what's going on already. So already now, today, there's a massive quantitative easing scheme going on in Europe, where the central bank is in fact purchasing assets from the private banks and then giving them central bank reserves in return. The problem with this is that the result is just that you get a lot of central banks reserves sitting on the private banks' balance sheets, so they never enter into the real economy, you might say. So the idea here would also, so on the one hand, we would sort of solve the problem of moving the money over into the central bank. But then once the central bank owns all these mortgage bonds, they can then turn around to the farmers and then say, we will wipe out this debt in return for your land. So they can use these bonds to purchase the land from the farmers. And then we have this situation, or the state that Jørgen Steen Nielsen is also suggesting, that now the public, the state, owns the land, and then the farmers would rent the land from the state rather than owning it. Then some critics might say, well, isn't that a return to feudalism? I think a lot of farmers, that would be their sort of instinctive, didn't we abolish this 200 years ago? We don't want to go back to feudalism. So the idea here is that feudalism is constituted by the fact that farmers are tenants under a landlord rather than owning their own land. I think the answer to this question, the question here, is this not feudalism, is yes, it is feudalism. However, we already have feudalism because the land today is not really owned by the farmers. It's owned by the banks. So what we're doing is we're substituting one form of feudalism, financial feudalism, where the banks own the land, to another form of feudalism where the state owns the land. So even if you might feel sort of uncomfortable with the state owning the land, you should ask yourself, well, maybe it's just a little bit better than the banks owning it. So the idea here is to use this helicopter money, and the helicopter idea is, of course, that when the central bank has this capacity to create money out of nothing, and this money is then used to essentially sort of wipe down debt and buy up land. And we usually refer to helicopter money as quantitative easing. I would argue this form of helicopter money would constitute quantitative strengthening. So we would strengthen the economy rather than easing the economy. Okay. I want to go back to the Tuchman story here, because I think there's another central point to take away from the joke. We tend to think of central banks as administrative entities, and we tend to think of central banks as technocrats. And that's certainly also how central bankers and central banks like to present themselves. They're like, oh, central banking, so boring. Ooh, it's just about applying these technical models, and there's nothing going on here. No. You go on, talk about something else, and then we'll fix this over here. I think what goes on in the Tuchman joke is that, or where the joke kind of turns, is right at the point where we move from economics to politics. Right at the point where it is suggested that they should throw out, or Tuchman should throw himself out of the plane here. So I think the point here is that the creation of money should never be regarded as merely a technical or even just merely an economic act. It's very much a political act. It's very much a political act. And that means that if we want to have, we define ourselves as a democracy, yeah? That's like considered as an ultimate good of our society. But I believe that if we want a true democracy, not a weak democracy, but a true democracy, we must include this act of money creation into the sphere of democratic policy. So the point here is, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that we should start throwing central bankers out of planes or helicopters. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that we should regard monetary policy and monetary creation or money creation as political actions that should be part of our democratic debate. It should be part of when we have an election. We should have like one party saying, oh, I don't think we should create more money. And then another party say, oh, yes, well, I think we should. And one party say, oh, we should lower interest rate. And we should. Yeah, I want people fighting. I want the parties fighting about where to drop the money. But that's not part of our discussion today. To me, we're discussing things that are much less important. Like now, today, we have this discussion about the topskat. I think it's not important. Compared to the money creation issue, it's a minor issue. It's not important, but yet it's sort of blown up, and now maybe it'll lead to a change in the government or something like that. Okay, so basically, kind of to sum up, there was an economic point that we should realize that having a national bank, and don't get me wrong, I think we have a great central bank in Denmark. I think we have a really good national bank. But I also think that in this national bank, eller Nationalbank, the central bank, it has a huge potential which is not being utilized. It's not being, it seems as if wars is the only thing that can sort of mobilize central bank. That's, if we look throughout history, that's kind of where governments say, oh, now we need to create money, now there's a war. I think we should say, no, let's not wait for a war. Or, we have plenty of them already. We don't have to wait for them. I think we should say, oh, now we have a huge crisis here. We have a crisis of ecology. Let's mobilize money creation for that purpose. So we should realize this potential, and we should realize all the great things we can do with this money creating machine, and we should include that in our political discussions. I think that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.